introduction. Again, my name is Brendan Mitchell, and let's go ahead and get this started then. Here's a quick roadmap of where we're going with this. I'll talk about where my capstone project took place, kind of talk about the social context of the area, then go into my partner organization, as well as the two different aspects of my capstone project, drawing on conclusions for both of them, and then my own personal reflections on the capstone project and the program as a whole. So for anyone who doesn't know, my project took place in Uganda, which is the country that's sandwiched right between the Democratic Republic of Congo and Kenya. We zoom right in on that. That little pin right there is the approximate location of where I was staying in this country. And if we zoom in further with this nice map from the Uganda Wildlife Authority, here is Murchison Falls National Park. For context, our safari lodge up there is exactly where I was staying, about like 10-minute walk from there. Murchison Falls National Park is the biggest national park in Uganda. And another interesting fact is it is the only one in Uganda where there aren't villages directly located within the park. Most of the other ones, Queen Elizabeth and a few others, people actually live within the park. Here, it's only park rangers that do so. Park rangers and a few other conservation organizations. But Murchison Falls also is home to 4 of what we call the big 5 species. So for that, we have lions, buffalo, elephants. We also have leopards. Apologies for not having a picture of that. Leopards are nocturnal and notoriously difficult to get on camera. You'll just have to take my word for that they exist there. We also have big 5 habitat for an endangered subspecies of giraffe, known as the Rothschild giraffe. And it's also home to hippos. This particular fella decided to make its residence in the place that we were all staying, much to the concern of everyone involved. Also got trapped in a house for 15 minutes by this guy. So I'm very well acquainted.
Hippos are the meanest vegetarians on the planet.
They are.
My conclusion is like, how can you be so mean and just eat grass?
Even lions don't want to mess with them. So you know what? They can exist. That's fine. Diving then into kind of the social side of the social ecological system. First up, we should talk about livelihoods. The biggest form of livelihood here in Uganda is farming. That takes the form of both agriculture as well as animal husbandry. Here's an example of one of the farms that directly borders Murchison Falls National Park. Now, because some of these farms do border the park, there's issues with crop raiding and also livestock depredation by pretty much every single major wildlife in the area. There are ways to prevent things like that from happening, such as planting these chili pepper trees, because the peppers actually deter elephants, hippos, etc., from approaching the farms. There's some problems with that, though. Pretty much all deterrent methods, whether it's fencing or chili peppers or what have you, they're very expensive. And if you are a subsistence farmer, or if like you're barely making any money to finance your family, you can't afford to do stuff like this. Additionally, things like this, you have to have the entire perimeter of the farm surrounded. If there's even a little bit of a break, wildlife is smart enough to know, oh, I can just skirt around the edge and find the entrance into the farm. So that's a major problem in this region. And that kind of results in poaching occurring, because if you're a subsistence farmer and you need the crops and you need the livestock in order to feed and raise your family, if a wildlife animal goes and takes out some of your crops or takes out some of your livestock, you're going to want to retaliate in some fashion. A lot of times the poaching does take the form of retaliatory killings. Other times, if you are desperate enough, people go out into the park, set up traps, whether it's snare traps with wires or whether it's like jaw traps, in the hopes of catching something that they can then either sell off or butcher for meat. So poaching is a pretty major problem in Uganda, especially, and in Murchison Falls. The next thing we want to consider is languages. There are over 40 active native languages throughout Uganda. In just the area that my partner organization operates in, there are 2 different districts that we work closely with, Pakwach and Wadale, and both of them have different native languages. There's also English is a pretty common language, but again, if you're not in a high urban area, that's not a language you probably will run into very often. Otherwise, it's Luganda, which is the other more common language. So if you're doing conservation work in Uganda, you need to make sure that you know what active languages are in the area and hiring local translators to be able to speak the science in a way that people will be able to understand. Additionally, there's education. So education is a really interesting situation where most people have primary education access. What becomes the issue, though, is most colleges are found in the more popular towns and cities. And if you're in a remote village that is, say, 2 hours away, buses don't go over there because the roads are too treacherous. People oftentimes aren't able to afford vehicles to get to colleges. And so you're relying on bodabodas, or essentially motorcycles, to get from one area to another, and those are unreliable as well. So unless you're in a major urban area, chances are you're not getting a university education. So that's just important to keep in mind when you're working with people, that a lot of the terminology that conservationists use, that's not going to be in terms that, it's not terms that even people here would be able to understand. So it's important to keep that in mind. And then finally, there is Uganda Wildlife Authority. UWA, as we call them, are the main conservation governance body in Uganda. They go out to remote parts of the park and in all of the parks throughout Uganda to do snare sweeps, to check in on livestock, or check in on wildlife rather, and to track and kind of report data out to the government. There's some issues there though. UWA is a very militant organization, and they have in the past had issues with UWA rangers actually shooting people that they found in the park that weren't supposed to be there. Which again, yes, poaching is bad, but when you consider the fact that it's a necessity for them to survive, is killing the right method? Not really. So that's a major problem. The flip side of that is that some rangers actually support poaching, either indirectly or directly. Especially in post-COVID times, UWA does not pay the rangers anywhere near enough to be able to sustain their own lives. And these people are working in remote ranger outposts where they don't have access to pretty much anything for groceries outside of like a once a week or once every couple week trip. So they're not getting paid anywhere near enough to sustain their own families. So if a poacher approaches a ranger and asks for assistance, some rangers might take them up on the offer for additional cut of the profits. Also, UWA's got some problems with how there's a whole oil industry situation happening within the national parks and looking to do oil drilling. So there's a lot of complicated situations within UWA and how they relate to local people. And that's where my partner organization comes in, Snares to Wares. Snares to Wares is a 501c3 nonprofit that started in a village in Uganda called Pakwach. It was co-founded by Dr. Robert Montgomery, and at the time, his grad student, now full-time professor, Dr. Titilo Mudumba. They were doing large carnivore research in Murchison Falls, and in talking to people in Pakwach, they heard the complaints from the community members that poaching is a serious problem. A lot of the people in some of these nearby villages recognize that if poaching continues at the rate it's currently going, there's not going to be wildlife for the next generations to be able to enjoy. And they themselves have admitted that like they want to see these animals thrive. So this all started under that context, taking what people were saying and saying, how can we then fix this issue? So some of the things they do is they will go out with the UWA rangers into the parks to do snare sweeps, to collect discarded snare wire. They will also go and find discarded tires, bring them back, burn them down, and to get access to the tire wires that are found, which are the common types of wires that are used in snare traps. They then take those tires and they have a team of artisans in a couple different villages that they pay up front for their efforts to make various sculptures, such as this here lion, which is their more common type, the smaller variety, or their bigger ones like this life-size elephant here. This was one that they worked on. I want to say it was back in 2019 is when they finished this one. They have a few other ones, like they're working on a rhino right now. So they will take all this discarded snare wire, turn them into sculptures of these species that snare traps oftentimes grab on accident, because oftentimes they're looking to get wildebeest, but traps are not discriminatory. They will catch any and all species that are in the area. So they turn into these sculptures, turn around, the organization then resells them out to sometimes the safari lodges they will partner with, other times it's zoos. Pre-COVID times, there's a lot of international selling they would do. And then they turn around, funnel that money back into various conservation efforts, funnel it back into the communities to help fund other like education and training outcomes for the people that work with them. Basically trying to support the local communities in any way that they can. And so that's where I come into this. So my Capstone project took two different forms. The first is this World Lions Day event that we wanted to host. This was a conversation that the co-founders and I had prior to me traveling to Uganda, especially post-COVID for Uganda. We wanted to be able to host an event in the park, bring in community members so that they could see aspects of the park that they'd never been able to see before. Again, trying to get the transportation to the park, trying to pay the entrance fees, that's oftentimes too much for the people that even live right next door. So we wanted to provide that opportunity to be able to see wildlife in a way that's not just crop raiding and livestock killing. So what we did was early June, the research team and I ended up going to Wadale, which is one of the more remote villages. And we talked with them to kind of check in because Wadale started working with Snares to Wares back in mid to late 2019. And then COVID happened. Uganda's COVID restrictions were so severe that they didn't let up until February of this year. So that was over 2 years where you could not even travel across district lines. So for instance, Wadale was in the district of Wadale. Snares to Wares operates within the Para district within Murchison Falls. And then we have the team in Pakwach in the Pakwach district. They couldn't travel across district lines for anything outside of getting groceries. So for Pakwach, that wasn't much of an issue. The team had been part of the organization since 2015. Communication was fairly well established. People had been able to save up enough money through working with Snares to Wares to afford phones so they could at least check in every once in a while over the calls. However, for Wadale, since they just started, people hadn't saved enough money to be able to afford cell phones. Plus cell reception out there is very challenging. So for 2 years, Wadale was in the dark as to what Snares to Wares was doing because the organization couldn't reach out to them. So when we did this meeting in June, this was the first proper check-in the organization had been able to do since the restrictions let up back in February. And rightly so, the village was a little bit concerned that they had just been abandoned by the organization. But after being reassured that, no, we are still trying to work with you, we want to reestablish contact and try to adapt to where we are now, the village was a lot more comfortable with the situation. And one of the younger guys that works with Snares to Wares in Wadale asked, can you guys then bring us into the park as a sign that you are listening to us, that you are trying to establish that relationship? Worked out rather well considering what my Capstone project was going to be. So that launched an entire planning session over the next 2 months for World Lions Day, which happens August 10th of every year to celebrate lion conservation. So we went through, we planned the budget, we reached out to our partners in UA and reached out to our partners in various safari lodges to ask for assistance in hosting this event. And when the day finally came, we took them early in the morning to safari drive within the park. This was taken right when we were seeing 2 lion cubs trying around a group of trees, which was fantastic because I was a little concerned just wanting them to see lions, because it would be unfortunate if we did a World Lions Day event and didn't see any lions. So I was very happy that they got to see that, but they also in like 1 hour drive managed to see pretty much every major species the park has to offer. So that was very fortunate. And I was very happy to see how excited everyone was, especially some of the elders who hadn't been able to see wildlife like this before. We then took them to the top of the waterfalls, Murchison Falls, hence the park name. We also then took them to this river site where we set up the elephant sculpture. Some of the community members that we had brought in, 25 from Pockwatch, 25 from Wildlife, some of those members actually had worked on that elephant sculpture. So they were very excited to be able to share with their friends and their family the processes they went through to build that. We then took them over to the UA warehouse where UA rangers will store all the snare traps. And this is a warehouse that is about the size of this room. And there are piles of snare wires and traps floor to ceiling, all the way front to back. So a lot of the community members saw that, and some of them even commented that they hadn't realized, they knew poaching was a problem, they didn't realize the full extent of it. And so they had that sobering moment, and were very much interested in helping reduce the stressors on wildlife. We then had lunch and ended our day with a game of soccer between the UA Rangers and the community members to help kind of build more relations there. We also had a local musician group playing some of the music there, which was really fun. Throughout this entire event, I was jotting down notes based on conversations I had heard, people coming up to me saying like what they liked, what they wish they could do differently. And then the day after, the research team and I sat down, talked about on our end what we think went well, what we think could change. And I compiled, I think it was a 12-page event report with all the planning materials, budget, the letters that we sent out to our partners, and the play-by-play of the day, and what comments and recommendations we brought forth to the table, so that way Snares to Wares in the future doesn't have to necessarily start from scratch when planning events like this. Because they want to do this at least annually, if not multiple times a year, bring in community members to kind of see parts of the park that they just aren't able to. Unfortunately, that is the end of the fun pictures section of this presentation. Now we talk about research. And oh boy, this was a hefty amount of research. So this was a conversation between the co-founders and I around the end of July. They wanted to have a research paper put out using Snares to Wares as a case study. And so one of the conversations we had, the idea of how can community-based conservation organizations better develop trust with their communities. That was a talking point that came up multiple times. So that started me down the rabbit hole of looking up. I ended up reading through over 60 plus articles on conservation successes, conservation failures, as well as what does trust look like in the realm of conservation. And we ended up coming up with these kind of 8 tenets or pillars of trust. These are rather purposely vague ideas that are then able to be applied in a lot of situations within conservation as to what does it take for people to trust a conservationist or a conservation project or an organization, and what you can do to maintain that over the long term. So some of the tenets we looked at were, we had transparency. So when we're talking about transparency in a conservation organization, we're talking about the transparency of mission, the values, the goals of the project and the organization, putting it into terms that the people you are directly working with, whether it is national or international work, putting it into terms that people can understand and be able to reiterate in their own terms. So that way there is no confusion as to what is happening. You're not sitting there thinking that they understand what you're doing, and then you step in and suddenly it goes off the rails because what you want to do, you did not communicate out properly to where people could understand. Additionally, there's consistency. So that is both in terms of consistency of communication. We saw with COVID-19 how if you're not able to consistently communicate with your community members, they might not trust you any longer, or they might have some concerns about, hey, are we still working together? What's going on? This also is in terms of consistency in benefits. That's form of payments, other forms of benefits, because if you are not able to pay your community members consistently, which some of the conservation failures I read pointed that out, that leads to people no longer trusting your project and wanting to see it actually crash and burn. Next, we have community context. This one's a bit wider in scope. It covers everything from what languages are present in the area, education levels, to what's the culture, like different cultural events, different cultural ties to the land. And in fact, it also covers the history that a community might have with previous conservation efforts. So if you were going to an area where they've had a bad time with conservation, maybe conservationists didn't listen to them, maybe they said they were going to do one thing and completely switched up on the people, they might be hesitant to trust you if you're coming into this area, regardless of what your intentions might be. Next is collaborative knowledge. This one is one that was very interesting in looking in the research, because in both successes and failures, there was kind of the indication that conservation scientists both are hesitant to share out the data that they collect, and in a lot of cases are hesitant to receive information from community members and to actively listen. So this is kind of set as a reminder that you should both share the data that you collect, because a lot of times community members are very interested in what were your findings, what's going on in this area. And if the community members obviously know more about the area that they live in than you do, actively listening to them and adjusting your plans accordingly. Then we tie into education and training. This is kind of paired with that consistency element, because this is another form of benefits. And in a lot of the conservation successes I read through, some of the reasons why they were successful were because when they crafted the project alongside the community members, they trained the people to be able to do the work. So that way, if the organization had to step out or step back, the project would still be successful in the long term. This is very important too for providing elements of degree training, because again, if you are working with an area that they don't have the ability to go to university for cost reasons, being able to provide that financial support so that they can then go do their degrees and get better education to better support their families, that builds a lot better trust as well. Next, we have the decision-making aspect. So this one is one that I found a lot of times in failures. Conservationists would come into an area, say, this is what we're doing, and then leave the project as is without the people they were working with having say in how that project would form. So this is just allowing community members to be able to voice their concerns, their opinions, and be able to weigh in on key decisions in the organization. So that way they also feel like they are taking ownership in the project and therefore have more pride in wanting it to succeed. Then we go into incorporating feedback related to that decision-making and listening, doing the active listening of if there are concerns raised, making sure you're incorporating that into the changes in your organization's functions. And then finally, we have the adaptive management section. Adaptive management is a concept that's been around for 20 some years, and yet in a lot of the failures within the last 10 years in published scientific articles, it was due to an inability to adapt to new situations. And kind of a added point to this, with COVID and other various pandemics hitting, it's important to also tie in a crisis management aspect to that. So making sure that, like, if everything goes absolutely haywire, you're still able to do some work in the future. So some of the conclusions we got out of this research were that some of these steps are more foundational than others. Really, all these tenets are kind of foundational, but some of the ones like transparency, collaborative knowledge, decision-making, and incorporating feedback are critical to do as soon as possible to help establish that trust and keep people engaged with the project. Then some require more effort. We're talking consistency, community context, and education and training. What I mean by this is that for some of these, it's very easy to kind of picture, how does this work? How can we establish this? But for the ones that require more effort, that requires you to sit down and go, okay, constantly challenging assumptions, constantly challenging what you think of the situation and how you can work better within this area. And then finally, adaptive management is a challenge. Again, a lot of the failures I read resulted from a failure to adapt to the situations at large. And so that brings us to then our reflections, or my reflections rather. The first being communication. Again, in a lot of the research I read and in my own experiences with Snares to Wares, communication can be a challenge. Not talking about just the language barriers, but talking about making sure that everyone's on the same page, making sure that everyone within your organization and everyone outwards understands what's going on. Additionally, adaptability is huge. As Brett will know, my project was changed quite a few times by my organization, and having to remain adaptable in that kind of stressful situation was critical to being able to complete my project. And this was also a case in a lot of the projects we had in classes, where it's just like, you have to remain adaptable. You have to be able to change with situations that go on. And then finally, kind of my personal growth section. I was fortunate prior to this program to have various leadership positions, whether it was being a resident assistant, all sorts of other tasks. But one of the things that I struggled with was necessarily standing up and taking that active leadership role. I was the kind of person that would always prefer someone else to take the lead, and I would just work alongside them. I was put into some situations with both this program and with my capstone that's like, I had to step up. I had to say, okay, what do we need to do to get this done? How can we be successful in this? And overall, I think that has set me up better to be able to lead projects with a little bit more confidence than I would have otherwise. Yeah, and with that, are there any questions? Audrey?
To be blunt, I mean, great job, by the way.
Thank you.
As a white person coming into a community that's more rural and remote, how was it to build trust in you with the people that you were working with?
Yeah, so that was actually a conversation that the co-founders and I had pretty much as soon as like this was decided that these were going to be my partner. This was going to be my partner organization. Kind of the idea that like, yeah, I don't want to step in and say, okay, so here's what we're doing. And it was taking this idea of sitting back, listening to what do the community members want. So with that World Lions Day event, hearing that they wanted something like that, being like, okay, that's a project then that I can really work towards and kind of do some of the background management and planning aspects rather than the upfront work necessarily. Because Snares to Wares is almost exclusively run by local community members. Save for Dr. Montgomery, they're all from Uganda. So it is the idea of just understanding what that looks like as someone of my skin color stepping into this situation and saying, okay, what do you want from my project? What can I do that helps the situation rather than necessarily talking for them?
And did you feel any pushback from community members?
No, actually what was really interesting is some of the community members actually took a liking to me immediately just because I was kind of an oddity in the situation. So that works well in my favor. And it also helped because a lot of the younger people that I worked closely with, they were able to kind of, because they know some of the local languages, they were able to speak for some of the elders and some of the other community members. And I could then kind of help relay information to the research team as needed. So it weirdly worked out rather well, surprisingly.
So, let me try to form kind of exactly what my question is. So a couple of years of COVID, so just kind of things were dormant. It's not necessarily that trust was lost. It had just kind of, it was just stagnant.
Yeah.
Do you have a sense pre-COVID, knowing that Bob was sort of the initiator of the organization, and kind of knowing Bob,
Yeah.
Do you have a sense for kind of what that journey was for the organization to build that trust? And I think I'm mostly talking like pre-COVID, like
Yeah.
what did it take to sort of be seen as legitimate and credible in the eyes of that community when Bob was the face of it for X number of years? Do you have a sense for what was that process, and what can you take away from that? When you've got kind of this, mixed history of conservation in a place like Uganda.
Yeah, absolutely. So Tutilo Mudumba, at the time, his grad student from Uganda himself. So there was already that aspect of, and Bob has said repeatedly that he didn't want to work in a country that didn't already want him there. So having Tutilo be like wanting to do work within his own home country, that was where Bob kind of said, okay, I can do some of the back end work while you do more of the active engagement with communities. Additionally, for like Pockwatch was the first community that Snares worked with back in 2015. And the only reason the organization even formed was the conversations that they had with community members, and the members expressing that, hey, there's this major poaching problem, and like we kind of want to help resolve this. So because I started working with Snares originally, I want to say it was like 2017, 2018. And by that point, the only community they had been working with was Pockwatch. So it's been a very slow, gradual expansion to other communities. I think right now they've also got 1 or 2 communities out near Queen Elizabeth National Park that they work with. So it's kind of like this slow, gradual process of building that trust first, laying the foundation of like, what is this relationship going to look like? And making sure that it's the local people that are doing much of the work on that end. So it's not just, here's a white person stepping into this. So because Bob right now manages a lot of the more grant writing, a lot of more financial and kind of relationships with other organizations rather than actually being up front and center usually. So.
I have two questions.
Absolutely.
What are you doing next? And with that, it's been really cool because I've been in your little group, right, watching you, and this is probably the project that came in and actually is the closest to what you thought it was going to be. Like you came in with this already and realizing it, and I'm just wondering what you're taking from this for what you're going to do next.
Yeah. So right now the paper's still kind of in the works. I finished the draft, but what's kind of the immediate next step is just Bob Tutila and I working on finalizing it so it's ready for publishing. Beyond that, as far as like career planning goes, I'm very interested in working kind of in a more, I guess, consulting sort of fashion. I really like the idea of kind of puzzling out the social ecological systems and seeing like, okay, here's what the issue is, here's how all these different strands connect to one another, and kind of helping other organizations see like, how can you better work with the people that you're supposed to serve, whether that's here in the US or abroad. So I'm kind of looking for more those kind of positions necessarily. As far as like how this project's going to aid in that was one of the things that I really enjoyed from this project, was being able to see this very complex situation and trying to unravel like, how did we get here? What does that look like then if this doesn't change or if that changes? And especially like, I really like the community aspect of conservation. I don't think any conservation project can be successful without including the people that live in these areas. So a lot of the conversations I had late at night with some of the people that live nearby, that kind of helped instill more of that idea of just, it's always the people that know more, and being able to have relations with them. That's the kind of thing that I took away from this and that I really enjoy doing.
Yeah. I have one more question.
Absolutely.
It's a really interesting paper. So where are you guys shooting to publish?
That is a good question. I think we might be aiming for conservation biology, but It's going to kind of depend on whether like what journal is especially applicable. It's this particular paper is one in a series that Snares has put out kind of indirectly.
Okay.
It'll be the third one in the series that they've done. And I think the previous two were published in ConBio, so that's probably where we're going to shoot for.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, cool.
Thanks. All right.
Is the organization, so help me out, that line, if it's being sold at a lodge in Uganda, what's the price of that? Give or take, if you know.
Yeah, so I believe this particular lion sculpture would run for like 75,000 Ugandan shillings, which I'd say that's like $13 to $20, somewhere along those lines.
That's it?
Yeah, so a lot of the
I pay
$50.
that.
I was like, well, and that's because correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe this one actually cost upwards of $80 to $90.
Yeah, okay.
And that was because of international shipping costs.
Sure.
Yeah, that's part of the reason why Snares is looking more domestically for selling their stuff, because they were finding that trying to fit all these sculptures into crates, because this takes up a lot of space for how little it weighs. They were finding that the shipping cost was just very expensive. When I was working for them originally, one of the teams of students was trying to look at striking a deal with like either FedEx or some other shipping company, but that wasn't able to happen before COVID hit. So,
Well, and I would imagine just from like on the business side that if the cost to make that is, let's say, $15,
yeah,
right, and a lodge can sell it for 80. Right, the lodge can make a profit, and so it's an attractive option to them. I mean,
Yeah.
ideally, it's more equitable on how much money the lodge is getting, how much the community is getting. But I guess that kind of and I can empathize with the shipping of stuff, because I mean, we just got a box for our nonprofit of stuff we're selling next week, and it was $450 to ship, and it was probably 3 feet by 2 feet.
Oh,
that's disgusting.
Yeah, I mean, it was heavy, weighed, I think it was 38 pounds, but so for what it's like, it's a business question that has nothing to do with conservation.
Oh, yeah.
Really. Are they able to fund, so they pay the artists and they're able to fund the staff for Snares to Wares through the sales only, or is charitable giving part of the financial model for Snares to Wares, or is it entirely funded by selling stuff?
Yeah, I don't know what the actual breakdown of it is, but like some of it comes from the selling of stuff. I know some of the like income that the organization actually gets, that people that work for them make, comes a lot from like grant writing and stuff. There's some donation aspect to it. I don't know what
Just
the
curious,
numbers,
yeah.
but yeah, a lot of it comes from grants. Interesting, like the funding for Snares Wares is fairly solid for a smaller nonprofit. But that doesn't leave a whole lot of wiggle room to do extra stuff. And they want to grow, are not able to do so quite yet.
Go ahead, Joe.
I might have said it and missed it, but is there, because the goal of the program is to reduce poaching, is there data on whether that is working, happening, like whether directly or indirectly from this program?
So that's actually something that they're wanting to do research into. So the lead of the research team right now, Sophie Jingo, she's doing her master's work while she's working with Snares Wares. And her research is kind of looking into the kind of social implications and what poaching looks like on the grander scale. There's the spreadsheet for that one. I think there were over 1,000 entries into. So it's a big project that she's doing for her thesis, looking at that kind of mentality and like whether poaching has increased or decreased. I don't think from that research they're necessarily going to get to that answer just yet, but it's kind of like step one in that process of figuring out, okay, are we actually doing what we set out to do? Are we able to reduce poaching pressures?
Those are such tough questions to answer because you don't know. So let's say no additional poaching occurred. Like, oh, was that successful? Because poaching just stayed the same. Well, maybe it would have gone up without snare, and you just don't know. Like, you don't know how to define success sometimes. All these factors influence what draws someone to poach or not poach.
Right.
And so we kind of like simplify it to like, well, if there's less poaching would be success. Like, God. Or a slower increase in poaching would be success. And it's just hard to know where to set that.
And especially when there's other conservation organizations involved, like you have the Uganda Conservation Federation that's working there as well. And so you have a bunch of different organizations. Is any one more successful than the others, or is it because that there's all these like this web of conservation organizations in the area that's reducing the poaching pressures? Yeah, it's a tough question.
I can relate to this so much.
Because I'm in post-presentation, but what was the main source of poaching? Like, was the village that you were working with, were they like poachers? Was it outsiders? Was it other?
It's predominantly the villages that border the national park. So like for instance, like Potwatch, yeah, we have a team that works directly with Snares. Some of them were former poachers. Same with Wadley, some of them were former poachers as well that have since now that they're getting benefits again post-COVID. There's that aspect of, because poaching is a very dangerous thing to do if you are that desperate. First of all, there's trying to cross into the national park and avoiding capture by rangers. There's the wildlife, which is very hostile. And there's no guarantee that you're actually going to get anything. So it's not a lucrative model at all. It's only for people that are like truly have hit that point of, I can't feed my families, I can't sustain them. So if like a lot of these former poachers that now work with Snares, now that they're getting money from the organizations, like, I don't have to do this, great. Let me not then. But yeah, so a lot of the poachers come from the local communities around park.
Is poaching for bushmeat? Is that primary? I mean, I know there's a myriad of reasons someone participates in poaching, but is that what are sort of the common motivations for poaching given the risk?
Yeah, most of it is for bushmeat. There's some of it that happens for some of the more trophy aspects, but that's not as common in Murchison Falls necessarily. I think that happens more in some of the other parks. Yeah, it's mostly for that bushmeat aspect, which again, like if the traps only caught wildebeest, that wouldn't be a problem. Those things are everywhere. So, but yeah. Yes, Mom?
We're a softball.
Yeah. Oh, no, not my first.
Given that those communities, because of COVID hitting, they felt they got left behind.
Mhm.
One, do you feel that the Lions Day helped bridge that? And two, has anything been implemented so that if COVID were to hit again and they have to go into lockdown like that again, do they know that they're going to have some kind of interaction with their Snares to wear?
Yeah, so yes, the World Lions Day, we do believe that actually helped because we reached out to both communities, Potwatch and Wadley, about a week after the event had taken place, just kind of let like the feelings kind of settle and see how they felt about it afterwards. And there were both during the event and then afterwards, there were kind of the motivations to do the work to make the snare wire sculptures and to help with conservation efforts. We saw there was like a rise in that. And then as far as what was the
Just are they confident enough that if they had to go into lockdown again for another disease or COVID or whatever, that somebody from Snares to Wares will stay and try to get word out to them? Or
yeah, so I think with Wadley, they now at least one community member, there might be a couple now, have access to cell phones now.
Oh.
So there is that aspect of we can now reach out to them without having to physically be there if worst case scenario were to happen. But yeah, there's with like COVID kind of happening and kind of the mess that caused, Snares to Wares looked at how they run the organization, like, okay, we need to make sure we have these communication systems in place so that way we don't leave anyone behind and they know what's going on.
But imagine I'm making some assumptions, I haven't been to that part of Uganda, but that face to face is such. It's the most common strategy
Yes.
for relationship building, and it's not substitutable. I mean, we all recognize that, but we sort of, adapt like, okay, life on Zoom, whatever, but it's just, I'm guessing it's just not easy to have a substitute for how do you keep a relationship up when you can't be face to face in that culture.
Yeah,
It's hard, I think, to figure out what is the alternative.
yeah, because that was the thing, is just like, once we did that first meeting in June, we then met up with them again, like 2 or 3 times while I was there in country. Just to kind of continuously do that check-in. And that was something that Snares was doing prior, was like every month or every couple of weeks doing check-ins with various community members that were working with them. So yeah, it's a tricky situation without having that kind of face-to-face interaction for sure.
Right. Well, if there are, I'm just checking Zoom real quick. No other questions. I'm gonna, number one, remember to stop the recording.